Madness is hereditary. In the case of the Danforth family, the kings of the Ralston-Purina Empire, cruelty was not a defect. It was a genetic trait, passed down from father to son like a crown. That red and white checkerboard is not a symbol of Midwestern purity. It is the family crest of a 3-generation war on empathy. They didn't just sell grain. They engineered a century of suffering. William H. Danforth was the fanatic who broke the human spirit to build his fortune. His son Donald was the cold-blooded architect who broke the animal kingdom to maximize efficiency. And the heirs were the negligent aristocrats who simply washed the blood off the money. This is the timeline of a bloodline that got rich by industrializing pain. Welcome to the autopsy of the checkerboard kingdom. Was he a CEO or a cult leader? The pathology of the Ralston-Purina Empire begins with the psychological wreckage of its founder, William H. Danforth. Born in 1857 in the mosquito-choked wetlands of Charleston, Missouri, William entered the world as a biological failure. He was a frail, shivering child, raised in a region locally known as the swamps, where malaria and typhoid claimed the weak with brutal regularity. This childhood fragility is the key piece of evidence in his psychological profile. Like many future tyrants who start life as victims, William developed a deep-seated terror of his own powerlessness. The pivotal moment of his life, the trauma that would eventually dictate the working conditions of thousands of employees, occurred in a damp schoolhouse. A teacher looked at the pale, sickly boy and issued a challenge that struck him with the force of a divine command. "I dare you to be the healthiest boy in the class." That sentence fractured his psyche. William did not hear it as encouragement. He heard it as a binary ultimatum between life and death. He began a fanatical, almost masochistic regimen of chest expansion exercises, dietary restrictions, and physical denial. He declared war on his own biology. He came to believe that sickness was not a medical reality, but a moral failing. He concluded that fatigue was simply a lack of character. This transformation from a sickly victim to a virile man created a dangerous cognitive distortion that would become the cornerstone of his business empire. The belief that anyone can overcome anything if they just push hard enough. He lost the capacity for empathy because he viewed weakness as a sin. When he founded his company, he was not looking for workers. He was looking for converts to join his crusade against human frailty. In 1894, William founded the Robinson Danforth Commission Company in St. Louis, which would become Ralston-Purina. He was not content to simply sell horse feed mixed with molasses. He wanted total ideological submission. He remembered a family from his youth who dressed their children in checkerboard cloth to identify them in a crowd. He seized upon this image with an obsessive intensity. A grid is the ultimate symbol of order. Straight lines, sharp corners, no ambiguity. It imposes structure upon chaos. William painted his entire world in this pattern. The factory walls were checkerboard. The delivery trucks were checkerboard. But his obsession crossed the line into madness when he turned the logo into a mandatory uniform. He demanded that his sales force wear checkerboard ties, checkerboard shirts, and even urged them to wear checkerboard underwear. This was not branding. It was the erasure of identity. By forcing grown men to dress in the clownish colors of the company, he was stripping them of their individuality and rebuilding them as Purina people. In the 1920s, while other industrialists were focused on steel or oil, William was building a monopoly based on enthusiasm. He realized that if he could brainwash his workforce into believing they were part of a holy mission, he could extract maximum labor for minimum pay. He instituted a surreal morning ritual at the St. Louis headquarters. Before the work began, hundreds of dust-covered warehouse men were forced to gather and sing company hymns. William wrote the lyrics himself, verses that praised the glory of the checkerboard and the virtue of breaking a sweat. It was a mechanism of psychological conditioning designed to fuse the worker's soul with the corporation's balance sheet. If you didn't sing loud enough, you were marked as disloyal. If you didn't wear the tie, you were an unbeliever. William Danforth was the high priest, and the feed mill was his temple. The primary instrument of William's control was his book, I Dare You. Published as a manifesto, it is often mischaracterized today as a harmless self-help classic. A forensic reading of the text reveals it to be a manual for self-destruction. The core concept is the four-square life, arguing that a person must be equally developed in four areas: physical, mental, social, and religious. William drew a square and told his employees that if one side was shorter than the others, they were broken men. This was a trap. He defined religious not as spiritual contemplation, but as the worship of the work God gave you. He defined physical not as health, but as the stamina to endure longer shifts without complaint. He defined social as the ability to convert your neighbors into Purina customers. The dare was a weaponized psychological trigger. William would stalk the factory floor, lock eyes with an exhausted laborer who had been heaving 100-pound grain sacks for 10 hours, and say, I dare you to be the strongest man on this shift. He hacked their masculinity. He made them feel that taking a break was an admission of defeat. He created a culture where admitting to fatigue was shameful. The genius of the I dare you philosophy was that it internalized the tyranny. William didn't have to hire foremen to crack whips. The workers whipped themselves. They pushed their bodies beyond the biological breaking point to prove they were foursquare men. This led to a hidden epidemic of heart attacks, stress-induced ulcers, and nervous breakdowns among the workforce in the 1930s. But these casualties were never recorded as workplace injuries. They were simply discarded as men who couldn't take the dare. The indoctrination process was formalized at Camp Minnewanka. Located among the isolated sand dunes of Lake Michigan, this facility was established by the American Youth Foundation, a front organization bankrolled by William Danforth. It was here that he groomed the future lieutenants of his empire. Every summer, promising young employees and the children of the elite were shipped to Minnewanka. It was marketed as a leadership retreat, but the schedule was designed to break the will. The campers were subjected to sleep deprivation, woken up before dawn for a mandatory dip in the freezing lake, a ritual William insisted upon to shock the weakness out of the body. The days were filled with competitive sports, religious lectures, and silence hours, where they were forced to meditate on their own inadequacies. Accounts from former attendees describe an atmosphere of intense manufactured euphoria, similar to the revival meetings of the era. They were cut off from the outside world. They were fed a diet of simple food and complex ideology. William Danforth would appear on the dunes like a messiah, tanned and fit, preaching the gospel of the checkerboard. He challenged young men to live adventurously, which in his lexicon meant devote your entire existence to corporate climbing. The camp utilized classic cult techniques: isolation, physical exhaustion, repetitive chanting, and the deification of the leader. Young men left Minnewanka with a glazed, fanatical look in their eyes, loyal only to Danforth. They returned to St. Louis ready to work 16-hour days, convinced they were Christian soldiers in the Army of Commerce. This Minnewanka network formed the Praetorian Guard around the Danforth family, a layer of loyalists who would enforce the brutal culture for decades. The true cruelty of William's foursquare morality was exposed during the Great Depression. While the rest of America was starving, Ralston Purina was expanding, but this growth was built on a foundation of ruthless culling. In the early 1930s, as the economy collapsed, William did not cut his own salary or offer relief to his struggling workers. Instead, he initiated a purge framed as a spiritual cleansing. He used the foursquare metric to evaluate his staff. Those who seemed depressed, worried, or anxious about the economic crash were deemed to be failing in their mental quadrant. They were fired not for incompetence, but for negativity. William famously ordered his staff to catch the epidemic of enthusiasm. He demanded that everyone smile on the factory floor. He demanded that salesmen literally skip, into client offices. In the middle of the greatest humanitarian crisis in American history, William Danforth made it a fireable offense to be sad. This toxic positivity was a form of psychological violence. Employees who were struggling to put food on the table had to perform a pantomime of happiness to keep their jobs. Those who couldn't maintain the mask were discarded. There is a hideous irony in the fact that while Ralston Purina was selling chow to fatten up pigs and cattle, William was starving his employees of their dignity. He created a ghost army of former workers in St. Louis, men who had given their youth to the checkerboard, only to be cast aside when their backs gave out or their smiles faded. William walked past them on his way to church, clutching his Bible, convinced that their poverty was simply a failure to accept his dare. William H. Danforth died in 1955. The obituary in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch hailed him as a titan of industry and a great philanthropist, listing his donations to churches and his service in World War I. It made no mention of the broken bodies in the warehouse or the shattered minds of the Minnewanka graduates. But a man like William never truly dies. His pathology metastasizes. On his deathbed, he did not repent. He passed the checkerboard torch to his son, Donald Danforth Sr., along with a corporation that was wired to function like a religious order. He left behind a manual that would continue to poison the minds of future generations. His death was the first biographical casualty of the family. He died of cancer, a biological rebellion of the cells that mocked his lifelong belief that willpower could conquer sickness. The machinery he built was now self-sustaining. The cult no longer needed its leader. The Purina spirit had become a systemic virus, infected into the very drywall of the headquarters. Donald Sr. inherited a kingdom built on the premise that profit is God's reward for ruthlessness. The high priest was dead, but he had successfully trained his son to take this theology out of the warehouse and apply it to the entire animal kingdom. The I dare you philosophy was about to scale up from abusing humans to industrializing the torture of animals, turning the Danforth cruelty into a science that would stain the hands of the family with blood for the next 50 years. Why did he turn farms into prisons? When William H. Danforth was lowered into the ground in 1940, the weeping mourners in St. Louis believed they were burying the heart of the Ralston Purina Company. They were wrong. They were simply burying its mascot. The true brain of the operation had been waiting in the wings for years, quietly observing, calculating, and preparing to strip the empire of its romantic frontier trappings. Donald Danforth Sr., the founder's son, was a man cut from a different cloth. If William was the charismatic cult leader shouting from the pulpit, Donald was the cold, efficient bureaucrat whispering in the boardroom. He did not possess his father's messianic fire. He possessed something far more dangerous for the natural world, an engineer's detachment. Upon assuming the presidency, Donald looked at the vast checkerboard empire and saw inefficiency. He saw a company that was still too sentimental, too connected to the old agrarian rhythms of the 19th century. He realized that the "I dare you" philosophy, while excellent for breaking the spirits of human workers, was insufficient for the ultimate goal of the corporation, which was the total dominance of the food chain. To achieve this, Donald needed to change the fundamental definition of what an animal was. In the forensic history of agriculture, the 1940s mark a terrifying linguistic and philosophical shift. Under Donald's stewardship, a cow was no longer viewed as a living, breathing creature with biological needs and natural behaviors. It was reclassified as a protein conversion unit. A chicken was no longer a bird. It was an egg-laying machine with feathers. The goal was no longer to husband animals. The goal was to process them. Donald Danforth's greatest weapon in this war against nature was the pellet. Before the Danforth era, farmers fed their livestock a mix of forage, scraps, and raw grains, a diet that varied with the seasons and the harvest. Donald viewed this variation as a chaotic variable that needed to be eliminated. He championed the concept of scientific chow. Ralston Purina scientists working in white labs far removed from the muddy reality of the barnyard began to break down animal biology into a series of chemical inputs. They analyzed exactly how much protein, carbohydrate, and synthetic vitamin was needed to keep an animal alive just long enough to reach slaughter weight. They compressed this data into the famous Purina chow, hard, dehydrated, uniform pellets that look the same whether you bought them in Missouri or Maine. This was not food, it was technology. It was an industrial fuel designed to bypass the natural digestive rhythms of the animal. Donald marketed this relentlessly. He convinced the American farmer that nature was incompetent. He sold the idea that a cow didn't know what to eat and a farmer didn't know how to feed it. Only Purina knew. Only the checkerboard scientists had cracked the code of life. This was a brilliant psychological coup. By replacing raw grain with proprietary pellets, Donald made the farmer dependent on the corporation. You couldn't grow Purina chow in your field. You had to buy it from the mill. In one stroke, Donald Danforth Sr. transformed independent yeoman farmers into captive consumers of his industrial product. The outbreak of World War II provided the perfect catalyst for Donald's vision of a standardized world. War is, by definition, an exercise in logistics, and the U.S. government needed calories that were shelf-stable, transportable, and uniform. Donald Danforth placed Ralston Purina at the service of the state, not out of patriotism, but out of opportunity. The company secured massive government contracts to produce cereal for the troops and feed for the animals that would feed the army. While young American men were dying on the beaches of Normandy, Ralston Purina was exploding in profitability. Donald used the war to normalize processed food. Soldiers who grew up eating oatmeal or grits were now eating Chex and other processed grains from Purina factories. They returned home with a palate conditioned for industrial food. More importantly, the government's demand for meat, spam, beef, poultry to feed the Allies accelerated the industrialization of the farm. The old ways were too slow. The government needed more meat faster. Donald Danforth stepped forward with the solution. His high-octane chow could grow a chicken in half the time of a traditional diet. The war gave Donald the political cover to reshape American agriculture. Under the guise of national defense, he pushed for policies that favored high output, grain-fed systems over pasture-based systems. He embedded Ralston Purina so deeply into the national food security infrastructure that the company became too big to fail, long before the term existed. By 1945, The checkerboard was no longer just a logo. It was a badge of the military-industrial agricultural complex. The most chilling aspect of Donald Sr.'s tenure was the sanitization of slaughter. William Danforth had been a man of the earth, often seen with dirt under his fingernails. Donald was a man of the country club. He lived in the exclusive enclave of Clayton, St. Louis, attending the Episcopal Church of St. Michael and St. George every Sunday. He was the picture of the benevolent patrician. He donated to hospitals, sat on university boards, and spoke softly about civic duty. But this manicured image concealed a grotesque reality. The wealth that paid for his tailored suits and his pew at church was generated by a system that was becoming increasingly nightmarish. Donald presided over the transition from the barn to the confinement shed. He didn't have to watch the pigs go mad from overcrowding. He only saw the efficiency reports. He didn't have to smell the ammonia fumes that burned the eyes of the chickens. He only saw the profit margins on egg production. This executive detachment is a key forensic marker of the corporate psychopath. Donald Danforth Sr. perfected the art of compartmentalization. He could carve a turkey at Thanksgiving with his family, offering a prayer of gratitude while simultaneously signing orders that condemned millions of turkeys to lives of misery in windowless sheds, pumped full of antibiotics to survive the filth of their own existence. By the late 1940s, Donald had successfully turned Ralston Purina into a machine. He had removed the variable of compassion from the business equation. The animal was a unit. The feed was the fuel. The farmer was the operator. And the Danforth family was the banker. He had laid the concrete foundation for what would become the modern factory farm, but he had not yet erected the walls. That would be his next great crime. In the coming decades, Donald would not just supply the feed. He would redesign the farm itself, creating a blueprint for biological imprisonment that would define the rest of the 20th century. The pious butcher was just sharpening his knife. By the 1950s, Donald Danforth Sr. had saturated the market with his scientific chow, but he ran into a biological barrier that threatened the growth of the Ralston Purina stock price, the metabolism of the animal itself. A chicken running around a barnyard burns calories. A cow grazing on a hillside burns energy. In the cold calculus of the Danforth boardroom, this burned energy was wasted capital. Every calorie an animal used to walk, scratch, or regulate its own body temperature was a calorie that was not being converted into meat or eggs. It was a leak in the profit margin. Donald realized that to maximize the efficiency of Purina feed, he had to fundamentally alter the environment in which the animals lived. He had to stop them from moving. The solution was a radical architectural concept that would change the face of the planet: total confinement. Ralston Purina began to promote a new kind of farming, one that did not rely on pastures or sunlight, but on concrete, steel, and darkness. The logic was brutally simple. If you lock the animal in a box, you control every variable. You control the temperature, the light cycles, and most importantly, the movement. This was the birth of the battery cage for poultry and the feedlot for cattle. Donald Danforth Sr. did not invent these cruelties personally. He was too far removed in his St. Louis office, but he was the industrialist who scaled them. He became the Henry Ford of meat. He realized that a farm should not be an ecosystem. It should be a factory. In this new world, the animal was not a living resident. It was a component on an assembly line, immobilized to ensure the highest possible return on investment for the feed being poured into its trough. The first victim of this new Danforth doctrine was the chicken. Historically, poultry farming was a sideline business for women on family farms, a way to earn egg money. It was small-scale and decentralized. Donald saw this as an inefficiency to be crushed. Ralston Purina engineers helped design the modern poultry house, a long windowless tunnel ventilated by massive industrial fans. Inside, thousands of birds were crammed into wire cages stacked in tiers. The architectural details of this environment are horrifying. The wire floor was designed to let excrement fall through to a pit below, meaning the birds lived suspended over a lagoon of their own waste. The ammonia fumes rising from these pits were so toxic they burned the corneas of the birds and the lungs of the workers. But for Donald Danforth, this design was a masterpiece of vertical integration. By stacking the birds, he increased the density of protein production per square foot. Purina salesmen fanned out across the rural South and Midwest, pitching this modern system to struggling farmers. They sold it as a path to wealth. "Get off the tractor and get into the coop," they said. They offered financing packages, blueprints, and guaranteed contracts. But it was a trap. To buy into the Purina system, the farmer had to take out massive loans to build these specialized single-purpose barns. Once the barn was built, the farmer was locked in. The barn was useless for anything else. He had to buy Purina feed. To pay off the loan, he had to accept the price Purina offered for the eggs. Donald Danforth had effectively reinvented sharecropping. The farmer owned the debt and the risk. Ralston Purina owned the market and the profit. The independent yeoman farmer was reduced to a serf on his own land, acting as a janitor for the Danforth birds. Having conquered the bird, Donald turned his eyes to the cow. The biology of a cow is miraculous. It is a ruminant designed by millions of years of evolution to turn sunlight and grass, things humans cannot eat, into protein. But grass is slow. It takes years for a grass-fed steer to reach slaughter weight. Donald Danforth didn't have years. He wanted turnover. Ralston Purina pushed for the creation of the massive beef feedlots that now blight the landscapes of Kansas and Texas. Instead of roaming on grass, cattle were trucked into muddy pens where they stood hock-deep in manure, shoulder to shoulder with thousands of others. Here, they were switched to a diet that was biologically insane: corn and soy-based Purina pellets. Cows are not designed to eat corn. Their rumens are pH neutral, designed for fiber. When you force-feed them high-energy grain to fatten them quickly, their stomachs become acidic. They develop bloat, liver abscesses, and ulcers. They live in a state of chronic low-level illness. But for Ralston Purina, this sickness was a feature, not a bug. Because the cattle were sick, they needed medication. This opened a new revenue stream. Purina began mixing antibiotics directly into the feed, not to cure disease, but to prevent the animals from dying just long enough to be killed. This was the subtherapeutic use of antibiotics, a practice that forensic epidemiologists now identify as a primary cause of antibiotic-resistant superbugs in humans. Donald Danforth Sr. was literally poisoning the future of human medicine to sell more grain in the present. The marbled beef that Americans came to prize was in reality the pathological result of a metabolic disease induced by the Danforth diet. Why did Donald Danforth insist on windowless barns? The official reason was biosecurity, keeping disease out. The calculated reason was psychological domination. In the pig industry, another sector Purina revolutionized, they discovered that if you keep pigs in the dark, they are less aggressive. Pigs are highly intelligent, social animals. When you lock them in gestation crates, metal cages so small the mother sow cannot turn around for her entire adult life, they go insane. They chew the metal bars until their mouths bleed. They engage in stereotypical behaviors, rocking back and forth like institutionalized mental patients. By removing sunlight, Purina removed the animal's connection to the circadian rhythm of the earth. They could manipulate the light to trick the animal's body. In broiler chicken sheds, the lights were kept dim and on for 23 hours a day to encourage constant eating. Sleep was theft. Darkness was a tool. The animals existed in a timeless, seasonless void, a twilight zone of consumption. Donald Danforth Sr., from his oak-paneled office, viewed this as a triumph of engineering. He had rationalized the chaos of biology, but to achieve this, he had to numb himself to the sensory reality of his creation. He never had to hear the screaming of the sows in the farrowing crates. He never had to see the downer cows, cattle so fat and sick they collapsed under their own weight and had to be dragged to slaughter with chains. He simply looked at the spreadsheets. The lines on the graph were going up. The efficiency was increasing. The cost of meat was dropping, making it accessible to the masses, which bought the silence of the public. The ultimate crime of this era was not just against the animals, but against the ancient moral contract between humanity and the species we domesticated. For 10,000 years, there was a deal. We feed you and protect you, and in return you give us your milk, eggs, or flesh. It was a relationship of stewardship. Donald Danforth Sr. shredded that contract. He replaced stewardship with extraction. By the 1960s, the checkerboard was omnipresent in rural America. It stood tall on the grain elevators, casting a long shadow over the dying small towns. The Purina dealer was often the most powerful man in the county, the gatekeeper of credit and survival. But the soul of the countryside was rotting. The silence of the fields was replaced by the mechanical hum of the ventilation fans in the metal sheds. The smell of hay was replaced by the acrid stench of manure lagoons. Donald Danforth Sr. had built the blueprint of hell, but he sold it as the American dream of abundance. He convinced a generation of farmers that debt was progress and that cruelty was efficiency. As he aged, his heart began to fail, a poetic weakness for a man who had broken the hearts of the American heartland. He was building a legacy that would explode in the faces of his grandchildren. But for now, the money was rolling in, thick and fast, sanitized by the distance between the boardroom and the barn. While the feedlots of Kansas were filling with the stench of ammonia and dying cattle, Donald Danforth Sr. was busy constructing a very different kind of environment in his hometown of St. Louis. To the social elite of Missouri, he was not known as the architect of factory farming. He was known as the Saint. This is the ultimate paradox of the Danforth forensic profile, the ability to compartmentalize a life of industrial ruthlessness behind a facade of aggressive philanthropy. Donald channeled the massive profits extracted from the blueprint of hell into the Danforth Foundation. On paper, this was a noble endeavor. The foundation poured millions of dollars into education, urban renewal, and liberal arts colleges. They built chapels with stained glass windows depicting scenes of pastoral peace, scenes that had been utterly eradicated by the very business practices that paid for the glass. This was not just charity, it was reputation laundering. Every dollar given to a university was a brick in the wall that shielded the family name from the blood on the slaughterhouse floor. Donald walked the streets of Clayton like a feudal lord. He was a pillar of the Episcopal Church, a man who preached about the moral obligation of wealth. Yet, he rigorously opposed labor unions in his own factories. He fought tooth and nail to keep wages low in the processing plants, where men and women developed repetitive strain injuries, deboning chickens at breakneck speeds. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. He would spend Sunday morning praying for the poor and Monday morning signing directives that ensured his workforce remained the working poor. He created a caste system, the Purina people in the corporate headquarters, who enjoyed the benefits of the cult, and the expendable labor in the rural mills, who were treated with the same mechanical indifference as the livestock. By the late 1960s, the stress of maintaining this colossal contradiction began to take its toll on Donald's biology. The "I dare you" philosophy that his father William had drilled into him, the belief that a man must never show weakness, never slow down, never admit defeat, turned inward. Donald was a workaholic in the truest, most pathological sense. He micromanaged an empire that now spanned the globe, from the tuna fleets of the Pacific to the cereal aisles of Europe. But the human heart is not a machine. It cannot be upgraded like a feed mill. In the early 1970s, as the counterculture movement began to question the ethics of industrial capitalism, and as the first whispers of environmental regulation began to circulate, Donald's health faltered. He was fighting a war on two fronts: the external war to expand the monopoly, and the internal war to suppress the reality of what that monopoly had become. On a quiet day in 1973, the engine finally seized. Donald Danforth Sr. died of a heart attack. The pious butcher collapsed, his chest crushing under the weight of the stress he had manufactured. The obituary in the New York Times was glowing, describing him as a visionary leader who modernized American agriculture. It spoke of his dignity, his grace, and his generosity. It did not mention the battery cages. It did not mention the rivers polluted by the runoff from his feedlots. It did not mention the systematic destruction of the independent family farm. Donald's death left a vacuum that was more dangerous than his presence. He was the last of the true believers, the men who genuinely believed that industrializing nature was God's will. He was a tyrant, but a disciplined one. With his death, the restraints were cut. The empire passed to his son Donald Danforth Jr. and a cadre of professional managers who did not even have the pretense of religious morality. They were pure financial creatures. The transition marked a perilous shift. Under Donald Sr., the cruelty was at least strategic. Under the new regime, it would become chaotic. The company was now a headless giant, a multi-billion-dollar organism with an insatiable appetite for growth, but no moral compass to navigate the changing world. The Danforth delusion, the idea that you can be a good Christian and a ruthless capitalist simultaneously, was buried with Donald Sr. As the casket was lowered, the cracks in the dam were already visible. The scientific chow was causing unforeseen diseases in pets. The labor unions were getting louder, and somewhere in the dark corners of the supply chain, the pressure to cut costs was leading managers to look for cheaper, more dangerous ingredients to mix into the feed. The era of the pious butcher was over. The era of the poisoned bowl was about to begin. The family had lost its iron hand, and the ghosts of the millions of animals processed through their machine were about to come home to roost in the form of a scandal that would shatter the checkerboard facade forever: the poison bowl scandal. There is a sociometric axiom often cited in the study of family dynasties. The first generation builds the empire with blood and sweat. The second generation expands the empire with discipline and strategy. And the third generation consumes the empire with indifference. By the time the mantle of the Ralston Purina leadership passed to Donald Danforth Jr., the checkerboard cult was facing an existential crisis of faith. William H. Danforth had been a fanatic who believed he was on a mission from God. Donald Sr. had been an industrial architect who believed he was building a new world order. But Donald Jr., born in 1927 into a world of immense privilege and established power, was neither a prophet nor a butcher. He was simply an heir. In the forensic profile of the Danforth decline, Donald Jr. represents the dilution of the bloodline. He was not a villain in the active, malicious sense of his grandfather. He was a man of the country club, a polished socialite, and a civic leader who preferred the comfort of the boardroom to the dust of the feed mill. Under his watch, the fanatical, almost terrifying energy that had driven the company for 80 years began to dissipate. The Purina spirit, that bizarre mix of religious fervor and corporate loyalty, was replaced by the cold, sterile logic of the MBA. The company stopped being a family crusade and became a publicly traded asset, subject to the whims of Wall Street rather than the "I dare you" doctrine. This shift was fatal. The cruelty of the previous generations had been kept in check by a twisted form of paternalism. Without that paternalism, the cruelty became automated, anonymous, and eventually uncontrolled. During the 1980s and 90s, the era of Donald Jr.'s influence, Ralston Purina underwent a transformation that mirrored the financialization of the American economy. The focus shifted from making the best feed to optimizing shareholder value. The company began to diversify wildly, buying up batteries, ski resorts, and fast food chains. The checkerboard was no longer a symbol of agricultural dominance. It was a holding company for a disparate portfolio of assets. Forensically, this period marks the decapitation of expertise. The men running the divisions were no longer nutritionists or farmers. They were accountants. They viewed the ingredients in the pet food not as biological necessities, but as line items on a spreadsheet. Corn was a cost. Soy was a cost. Vitamin premixes were a cost. The mandate from the top was to reduce these costs quarter over quarter. Donald Jr., sitting at the top of this pyramid, presided over a culture where quality was defined as hitting the earnings target. This was the era where the dangerous practice of least cost formulation became the Bible of the industry. Computers were programmed to constantly adjust the recipes of dog and cat food based on the fluctuating prices of commodities. If corn was expensive this week, the computer would swap it for wheat. If wheat was expensive, it would swap it for rice hulls. The animal was no longer fed a consistent diet. It was fed a constantly shifting algorithm of the cheapest available sludge. Donald Jr. did not mix the feed himself, but he signed off on the systems that prioritized the profit margin over the physiology of the pet. He allowed the accountants to seize the steering wheel of the empire, and they drove it with their eyes fixed on the stock ticker, blind to the biological time bomb they were assembling in the supply chain. The metaphorical loss of control that plagued the business eventually manifested in a literal violent tragedy that signaled the end of the Danforth era. The end of the Danforth reign did not come with a violent crash, but with a slow biological decay that mirrored the company itself. Donald Danforth Jr. did not die in the driver's seat. He faded away. Passing away in 2013 from lung cancer, his death was the final quiet exhale of the family's direct influence. While he battled his own cellular rebellion, the corporation he inherited was being eaten alive by the cancer of financialization. By the time he was lowered into the ground, the checkerboard had already been sold off to the Swiss giants at Nestlé. The dynasty didn't crash, it dissolved. His death was sudden, chaotic, and messy, a grim reflection of the state of the company he left behind. Forensically, this accident serves as the event horizon. It marked the definitive end of the family's direct, monarchical control over the food supply. The king was dead, and there was no fourth generation willing or able to take up the "I dare you" scepter with the same intensity. The dynasty had crashed, leaving the machinery of the empire running at full speed without a conductor. His funeral was a grand affair, attended by senators and titans of industry. They eulogized him as a gentle soul and a philanthropist. But in the background, the sharks were already circling. The weakness of the heir had been exposed. The company was ripe for the taking. In the wake of the leadership vacuum and the changing global landscape, the final betrayal of William Danforth's legacy took place. The company was carved up. The agricultural feed business, the original Chow empire, was spun off as Agribrands. The human food business was separated, and eventually, the crown jewel, the pet food division, was sold to the Swiss giant Nestlé in a massive multi-billion-dollar deal. This was the cash out. The surviving members of the Danforth family, including Senator John Danforth and the other heirs, effectively washed their hands of the business. They took their billions and retreated into the world of politics, law, and high society philanthropy. They sold the checkerboard. They sold the Purina people. They sold the responsibility. By merging with Nestlé to form Nestlé Purina Pet Care, the identity of the St. Louis dynasty was subsumed into a global conglomerate. This seemed like a victory, a massive payday that secured the family's wealth for eternity. But forensically, it was an abandonment. By selling the company, the Danforths removed the last vestige of personal accountability from the supply chain. The Purina name was now just a brand owned by a corporation in Switzerland. The Danforth conscience, however warped it had been, was gone. The stage was now set for a catastrophe. The new owners inherited a system designed by accountants, running on least cost formulation, and sourced from a globalized supply chain that was opaque and unregulated. The diluted bloodline of the Danforths had walked away with the gold, leaving the door to the factory wide open. And through that open door, in the search for ever cheaper profits, a new and deadly ingredient was about to enter the mix. The family was safe in their mansions, but the pets of America were about to pay the price for the Danforth abdication. By 2007, the physical presence of the Danforth family had vanished from the daily operations of the feed empire, but their ghost remained in the machine. The Purina spirit had mutated into a cold, mathematical directive embedded in the corporate server's least cost formulation. This was the algorithm that Donald Danforth Jr. had allowed to flourish, a digital mandate to constantly scour the global market for the cheapest possible ingredients that met the bare minimum nutritional standards. In the forensic reconstruction of the 2007 disaster, we find that the catastrophe did not begin with a villain twirling a mustache. It began with a price fluctuation. The cost of domestic wheat gluten, a protein-rich byproduct used to thicken gravy and wet pet food, had spiked. The algorithm, blind to ethics and loyal only to the bottom line, looked for an alternative. It looked east. It found a network of suppliers in China offering premium wheat gluten at a price that was mathematically impossible, far below the global market rate. A prudent company, one rooted in the old world values of stewardship, might have asked, "How is this so cheap?" But the post-Danforth corporate entity, now a sprawling web of contract manufacturers and global sourcing agents, did not ask questions. They saw the price, they saw the certificate of analysis, and they signed the contract. This was the moment the checkerboard ceased to be a shield of protection and became a funnel for poison. The obsession with efficiency, birthed by William and industrialized by Donald Sr., had finally opened the gates to a predator that the Danforths never anticipated, the chemical adulterator. The agent of death was a white powder known as melamine. A staple of the manufacturing world, it belongs in factory floors, not digestive tracts. It is used to create flame retardants and formica countertops, materials designed to be indestructible. But when ingested, this industrial durability turns fatal. attacking the renal system with brutal efficiency. The question is not just what it does, but how a plastic precursor ended up masquerading as protein. The answer lies in a flaw in the testing methodology used by the entire global food industry, a flaw that Ralston Purina helped standardize. The standard test for protein content, the Kjeldahl method, does not actually measure protein. It measures nitrogen. Protein is heavy in nitrogen, so the test assumes that high nitrogen equals high protein. The Chinese suppliers knew this. They were chemical hackers. They realized that melamine is 66% nitrogen by mass, an incredibly high concentration. By mixing a small amount of crushed melamine powder into low-grade wheat flour, they could fool the Kjeldahl test. The machine would read the nitrogen spike and report that the white powder was high-quality wheat gluten. It was a phantom ingredient. It mimicked the chemical signature of food while being a deadly toxin. This was the chemistry of greed. The suppliers were effectively printing money by selling industrial waste as food. And the buyers, the giants of the American pet food industry, including the brands under the Purina umbrella, were willing accomplices in their own deception. They had fired the old-school millers who could tell good grain by smell and touch and replaced them with lab technicians who only looked at the numbers on a screen. If the spreadsheet said 60% protein, the shipment was accepted. The Danforth legacy of scientific chow had become a blindfold. They trusted the data more than the reality. When this tainted wheat gluten arrived at the massive canning factories in North America, it was mixed into the gravy of millions of pouches and cans of chunks in gravy-style food. It was cooked, sealed, and stamped with the trusted logos of the industry, brands that American families had trusted for generations. The tragedy that followed was a slow-motion biological massacre. When a dog or cat consumed the melamine-tainted food, the chemical entered their bloodstream. On its own, melamine is moderately toxic, but the fraudsters had been sloppy. The industrial scrap also contained cyanuric acid. When melamine meets cyanuric acid in the renal tubules of a kidney, a terrifying chemical reaction occurs. They bind together to form insoluble crystals. Forensic veterinarians who performed autopsies during the crisis described kidneys that were not just failed, but physically destroyed. The tubules were packed with millions of microscopic razor-sharp crystals. The kidneys swelled to twice their normal size, blocked by a crystal cathedral of plastic. The animals were not just sick, they were being turned into stone from the inside out. The symptoms were horrific: lethargy, vomiting, and a desperate, unquenchable thirst as the body tried to flush out the blockage. But there was no flushing it. The crystals were permanent. In living rooms across America, beloved family pets, animals that were considered children by their owners, began to die in agony. And for weeks, nobody knew why. The vets were baffled, the owners were hysterical, and the corporation kept selling the food. This crisis exposed the ultimate lie of the Danforth philosophy. For decades, Ralston Purina had marketed its science as the reason to buy their food. They claimed their labs were the best, their protocols the strictest. Yet a crude, low-tech chemical hack from a basement factory in China had bypassed their entire defensive perimeter. Why? Because the system was designed to catch accidents, not criminals. It was designed to check for bacteria or mold, not for industrial plastic. The scientific chow model was based on the arrogant assumption that the company knew everything that could possibly be in the food. They never imagined that someone would purposefully add flame retardant to the mix. Donald Danforth Jr. had been dead for 6 years when the melamine crisis hit, but his fingerprints were all over the disaster. It was the culture of outsourcing responsibility that he presided over that made the supply chain so opaque. The company didn't know the name of the farmer in China who grew the wheat. They only knew the broker who sold the powder. They had traded intimacy for efficiency. In the spring of 2007, as the reports of dead dogs and cats began to flood the FDA hotlines, the executives in St. Louis and Switzerland were paralyzed. The algorithm had no contingency for this. They were facing a black swan event generated by their own greed. The legacy of the checkerboard, which William Danforth had intended to be a symbol of purity, was about to become the symbol of the largest consumer product recall in history. The poisoned bowl was on the floor, and the harvest of sorrow had begun. By March of 2007, the silent massacre was no longer silent. It was screaming in the waiting rooms of veterinary clinics across North America. The pattern was undeniable and terrifying. Healthy dogs and cats, animals in the prime of their lives, were being brought in with acute renal failure. Their creatinine levels were off the charts. Ultrasound scans revealed kidneys that were calcified, glowing white on the monitors like stones. For weeks, the veterinarians were fighting a ghost. They suspected antifreeze poisoning. They suspected heavy metals. They did not suspect the expensive foil-wrapped pouches of savory cuts or prime fillets that the owners had lovingly fed their pets that morning. The ultimate betrayal of the Danforth legacy was this: the poison was not in the trash can, it was in the food bowl. When the connection was finally made to the wheat gluten, the scale of the contamination revealed the monstrous complexity of the modern food web. The tainted ingredient hadn't just gone to one factory. It had gone to Menu Foods, a massive contract manufacturer that produced food for over 100 different brands, including top-tier lines owned by Nestlé Purina. This was the recall from hell. It wasn't just a bad batch of kibble, it was a systemic failure. The list of recalled products grew daily, turning every trip to the pet store into a game of Russian roulette. Families watched the news tickers in horror, realizing that the checkerboard seal of approval, the symbol William Danforth had promised would protect them, was actually a stamp of vulnerability. The official death toll remains a matter of forensic debate, clouded by corporate obfuscation. The FDA initially received 14,000 complaints, but independent veterinary associations and consumer groups estimated that tens of thousands of animals died or suffered permanent kidney damage. The response from the corporate entity was a masterclass in damage control, not empathy. In the critical early days, there was denial. Then there was minimization. Executives issued press releases stating that the risk was low and that only a small percentage of production was affected. But to the family holding a dying golden retriever, statistics were an insult. The Purina spirit of the 1920s, the fanatical devotion to the customer, was dead. In its place was a legal firewall designed to limit liability. The settlement that followed was grimly transactional. A class action lawsuit was settled for $24 million. Forensically, this amounted to a payout of a few $100s per dead pet. The legal system, much like the feedlots Donald Sr. built, treated the animals as property, as units with a depreciated value, not as family members. The Danforth heirs, safe in their political offices and philanthropic foundations, issued no public apology. They didn't have to. Their names were no longer on the letterhead. They had successfully privatized the profit of the last century and socialized the risk of the new one. The melamine crisis of 2007 shattered the psychological contract between the pet food industry and the public. It exposed the lie of the label. Consumers realized for the first time that made in the USA meant nothing if the protein powder came from a chemical plant in China. It revealed that the scientific chow was not formulated by nutritionists in white coats, but by algorithms hunting for the lowest bidder. The disaster was the logical endpoint of the least cost philosophy. Donald Danforth Jr.'s reign of benign neglect and financial optimization had eroded the safety barriers his grandfather had built. William Danforth had been a tyrant, but he was a tyrant who walked the factory floor and tasted the grain. The new regime tasted nothing but the profits. As the dust settled, thousands of urns containing the ashes of cats and dogs sat on mantels across America, silent witnesses to the failure of the industrial food system. But the checkerboard did not fall. It simply rebranded. The marketing department went into overdrive, plastering images of happy farmers and fresh ingredients on the bags, covering up the stench of the scandal. But the forensic file remained open. The melamine crisis proved that the company was willing to risk death for a fraction of a cent per can. And as we will see in the final chapter, this callousness toward non-human life was only a rehearsal, because on the high seas of Thailand, the supply chain wasn't just killing dogs, it was enslaving men. The chains of the sea were tightening, and the legacy of the Danforths was about to descend into its darkest, most human chapter, from slave ships to child labor. If the melamine crisis of 2007 was a crime committed by chemistry, the scandal of 2015 was a crime committed by physics. It was a crime of distance. By the second decade of the 21st century, the Ralston-Purina empire, now absorbed into the Nestlé conglomerate, but still operating on the logistical rails laid down by the Danforths, had expanded its supply chain to the very edges of the map. The checkerboard logic of efficiency, birthed in the cornfields of Missouri, had reached the tropical waters of the South China Sea. And there, far beyond the reach of American labor laws or health inspectors, the ultimate cost of cheap protein was finally revealed. The forensic trail leads us away from the clean, air-conditioned boardroom in St. Louis to the chaotic, sweltering port of Songkhla in Thailand. Here, the supply chain for America's most beloved cat food brands, including the premium Fancy Feast, begins. But it does not begin with a fisherman casting a net. It begins with a human trafficker counting cash. In 2015, investigative journalists from The Guardian and the Associated Press cracked open a secret world that the pet food industry had spent millions to keep hidden. They discovered that the marine proteins listed on the back of Purina cans were being harvested by a modern-day slave fleet. This was the final grotesque evolution of William Danforth's I dare you philosophy. The dare was no longer about working hard for a promotion. It was about working until you died to avoid being thrown overboard. The Purina people were no longer singing hymns in a warehouse. They were shackled by the neck in the hull of a trawler, invisible to the world that consumed their labor. This human misery is driven by a distinct culinary reality. While the marketing depicts gourmet fillets, the industrial machine runs on a vastly different fuel. The factories do not process the pristine tuna found in high-end restaurants. They process the ocean's refuse, known in the trade simply as trash fish. Trash fish is the industry term for the bycatch, the small, inedible, or bony fish that are scooped up from the ocean floor by massive bottom trawlers. These fish are too small to be sold at a market for human consumption. In a sane ecological system, they would be left in the ocean to sustain the food web. In the Danforth-Purina economic model, they are biomass. This biomass is valuable only if it is incredibly cheap. The margins on cat food are razor thin. If the cost of harvesting this trash rises by even a fraction of a cent per pound, the profit evaporates. This economic pressure creates a vacuum that sucks the humanity out of the labor force. No free man paid a legal wage would endure the conditions required to catch trash fish. The work is too dangerous, the hours too long, and the pay too low. So, the supply chain adapted. It stopped hiring workers and started buying slaves. The forensic link to the Danforth legacy is direct. Donald Danforth Sr. had spent his life driving down the cost of inputs to create least cost formulation. He built the engine that demanded cheap protein at any cost. The Thai slave captains were simply the fuel injectors for that engine. They were providing the raw material for the factories that stamped the checkerboard on the can, ensuring that the consumer in New York or London could buy a can of ocean whitefish for 80 cents. The investigation revealed the existence of ghost ships. These were trawlers that stayed out at sea for months, sometimes years, without ever returning to port. They were resupplied by motherships that brought fuel, ice, and new slaves, and took away the frozen blocks of trash fish. This system was designed for one purpose: to prevent escape. The slaves were mostly desperate migrants from Myanmar and Cambodia, lured by brokers with promises of factory jobs. Instead, they were sold to boat captains for roughly $400 a head. Once on board, they ceased to be human beings. They became machinery. Witness testimonies collected by NGOs and journalists paint a picture of hell that rivals the worst atrocities of the 19th century. Men were forced to work 20-hour shifts, hauling heavy nets in treacherous seas. To keep them awake, captains fed them methamphetamines. It was a chemical mirror of William Danforth's enthusiasm, artificial energy forced upon the worker to maximize output. Disobedience was met with medieval violence. Slaves were beaten with stingray tails, iron bars, and engine belts. If a man became too sick to work, he wasn't treated. He was thrown overboard to drown. Executions were common. Witnesses described seeing fellow slaves beheaded in front of the crew as a warning. Their bodies were tossed into the wake, disappearing into the same ocean that was yielding the savory salmon for the American market. This was the Ghost Fleet. It operated with total impunity because the end buyers, the giant conglomerates, practiced willful ignorance. They didn't buy directly from the ghost ships. They bought from the processing plants on shore. This extra layer of separation allowed them to claim plausible deniability, hiding behind a wall of paperwork while the blood washed off the decks at sea. The ultimate irony of this brutality lies in the marketing. The products derived from this slavery were often marketed as premium or gourmet. Fancy Feast, a jewel in the Purina crown, is sold with images of crystal goblets and white Persian cats. It is a brand built on the aesthetics of luxury and pampering. Yet, forensically, the contents of that can are the product of the most abject misery on the planet. When a consumer opens a can of cat food, the smell that wafts out is the smell of the trash fish slurry, a mixture of ground-up sea life that was hauled onto a deck by a man who had not seen land in 6 months, who was high on methamphetamines to stay upright, and who was terrified that he would be the next one murdered. The Danforth family had long since sold the company, but the brand they built was the vehicle for this crime. The checkerboard logo, which William Danforth claimed stood for purity, had become a seal of concealment. It sanitized the supply chain. It reassured the consumer that everything was fine, that the food was wholesome. The trust that the Danforths had cultivated for a century was weaponized to blind the public to the reality of the slave trade. When the scandal broke, Nestlé Purina admitted that forced labor was likely present in its supply chain. They launched internal investigations and audits. But forensic sociologists argue that these audits are theater. The supply chain is too murky, the ocean too vast. You cannot audit a ghost ship that turns off its transponder and disappears into international waters. The system that Donald Danforth Sr. pioneered, the vertical integration, the crushing of costs, the industrialization of biology, created a monster that could not be tamed. The demand for cheap meat is insatiable. As long as the algorithm demands least cost, there will always be a captain willing to use a whip to meet that price point. The ghost ships of Thailand are not an anomaly. They are the logical conclusion of the Ralston Purina worldview. If you view animals as mere conversion units and employees as resources to be exploited, eventually you arrive at slavery. It is the bottom of the slippery slope that began with the I Dare You camps in Michigan. The only difference is that in Michigan the chains were psychological. In the South China Sea, the chains are made of iron. For decades, the American consumer has comforted themselves with a geographical delusion that extreme labor abuse is a foreign disease. We tell ourselves that slavery happens on Thai fishing boats, or in Chinese sweatshops, or in the cobalt mines of the Congo. We believe that here, in the heartland of the United States, the land of the checkerboard, the 4-H club, and the county fair, our supply chain is clean. We believe that the factories William Danforth built are regulated citadels of law and order. But in February 2023, that delusion was shattered by a raid that exposed a crime so archaic it seemed to belong to the 19th century. The Department of Labor did not raid a distant outpost. They raided the slaughterhouses and meat processing plants of the American Midwest, the very same geography where the Danforth Empire was born. Inside, they did not find well-paid union workers maintaining the hygiene of the food supply. They found children, migrant children, some as young as 13 years old, were working the graveyard shift. They were not sweeping floors or filing papers. They were cleaning the kill floors. They were scrubbing the blood and fat off high-voltage bone saws, head splitters, and neck breakers. They were handling industrial chemicals strong enough to burn the skin off a human hand. This was the Children of the Bone Saw scandal, and it proved that the logic of the Danforth system, the relentless drive for efficiency, had finally cannibalized the most vulnerable population on American soil. The forensic mechanics of this crime reveal a sophisticated layer of corporate insulation. The children were not directly employed by the giant meat conglomerates that supply the raw materials for the global food industry. They were employed by a shadow entity, Packers Sanitation Services, Inc. This is the modern evolution of the Danforth model. In the old days, Ralston Purina hired its own janitors. But janitors are a cost. They require benefits, pensions, and safety training. So the industry fired them. They outsourced the dirty work to subcontractors like PSSI. The mandate given to PSSI was simple: clean the factory faster, cheaper, and better. This pressure created a market for illegal labor. PSSI managers, driven by the same I dare you quotas that William Danforth invented, turned to the desperate. They recruited undocumented miners who had fled poverty in Central America. These children were eager to help their families, and the system exploited that loyalty. They put them on the 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. shift. While American children were sleeping in their beds, these ghost workers were crawling inside massive meat grinders to scrape out the residue of the day's slaughter. The irony is blinding. The Danforth legacy is built on the image of the wholesome Midwestern boy. William Danforth wrote books challenging boys to be strong, healthy, and foursquare. Yet the industry he helped architect is now powered by the destruction of children's bodies. Investigators found kids with chemical burns on their faces, They found teenagers falling asleep in middle school classrooms because they had spent the entire night battling the gore of the slaughterhouse. The healthy boy of the 1920s has been replaced by the disposable child of the 2020s. The specific nature of the work these children performed is a forensic nightmare. Sanitation in a modern meat plant is not about soap and water. It is about chemical warfare against bacteria. The children were equipped with high-pressure hoses spraying caustic soda and chlorine-based acids. These chemicals are designed to dissolve protein, specifically the meat stuck in the machines. But human skin is also protein. The eyes are protein. When a 13-year-old slips on a greasy floor while holding a hose spraying acid, the result is catastrophic. The Department of Labor documented injuries that would be horrifying in a war zone, let alone a food factory. Yet, the supply chain kept moving. The next morning, the clean machines would roar to life to process the beef and chicken that would end up in Purina dog food bags and family dinner tables. The purity of the product was maintained by the toxic sacrifice of the child. This is the hidden cost of the scientific chow revolution. The factory farm system requires such massive scale and speed that it becomes a breeding ground for pathogens. To combat this, the sanitation requirements are extreme. The demand for sterile meat creates the demand for the graveyard shift. And because the profit margins are so thin, squeezed by the retailers and the feed costs, the only way to make the math work is to hire labor that cannot complain, cannot unionize, and cannot vote. When the scandal broke, the major food corporations issued the standard statements of shock. They claimed they had no idea this was happening. They blamed the subcontractor. They played the victim. But forensically, this ignorance is impossible to accept. In a factory system where every gram of protein is tracked, where cameras monitor every inch of the production line to prevent theft, it is inconceivable that plant managers did not notice an army of children arriving at midnight. They saw them. They knew. But they looked away because the work was getting done. This willful blindness is the final inheritance of the Danforth dynasty. It is the same blindness that allowed Donald Sr. to ignore the suffering of the battery hens. It is the same blindness that allowed Donald Jr. to ignore the risks of Chinese wheat gluten. And it is the same blindness that allows the current corporate owners to claim their hands are clean while their factories are scrubbed by 13-year-olds. The checkerboard was supposed to be a symbol of transparency, black and white, no gray areas. But in 2023, it became clear that the entire industry is operating in the gray, hiding its darkest secrets in the middle of the night, proving that the hunger for profit will eventually consume even the innocence of childhood. Where does the blood money go when it is finally scrubbed clean? It does not stay in the slaughterhouse. It migrates to the manicured lawns of Ladue and the marble halls of Washington, D.C. today. The Danforth family exists in a state of grace that is completely detached from the visceral horror of their origin story. They are no longer the feed kings. They are the statesmen. Senator John Danforth, an Episcopal priest and a diplomat, represents the final polished evolution of the dynasty. He is a man of immense respectability, a voice of moral reason in a chaotic political landscape. He officiated the funeral of Ronald Reagan. He speaks of unity and faith, but forensically, every dollar that funded his political rise, every cent that built the family's reputation for public service, was generated by the checkerboard cult. The foundation of his pulpit is the crushed bones of the factory farm and the broken backs of the Purina people. This is the whitewashing. The family has successfully laundered their history. They have built the Danforth Plant Science Center, a world-class research facility in St. Louis dedicated to feeding the world. It is a beautiful glass-walled cathedral of science, but it is also a tomb. It buries the memory of the past under the promise of the future. They fund research into genetically modified crops to solve hunger, yet they never acknowledge that their ancestors created the very system of industrial monoculture that made the food system so fragile and destructive in the first place. They are solving the problems they created and being hailed as heroes for it. The genius of the Danforth exit strategy was the separation of the name from the brand. By selling Ralston Purina to Nestlé, they ensured that when the scandals hit, when the dogs died from melamine, when the slaves were discovered in Thailand, when the children were found in the slaughterhouses, the headline said Purina, not Danforth. They privatized the prestige and socialized the shame. The Danforth name is now associated with university libraries and botanical gardens. The Purina name is associated with recalls and lawsuits. This was the perfect escape. They took the cash, kept the social standing, and left the dirty carcass of the corporation for the public to deal with. They are the old money now, and old money never smells like the barnyard. It smells like old books and fresh linen. As we close this forensic file on the Danforth dynasty, the verdict is not one of legal guilt. The statutes of limitations have long expired, and the lawyers have done their jobs well. The verdict is moral. The evidence suggests that William H. Danforth did not just build a company, he built a machine that consumes life to produce capital. He began by consuming the minds of his employees, daring them to work until they broke. His son, Donald Sr., consumed the dignity of the animal kingdom, reducing living creatures to units of production in windowless boxes. His grandson, Donald Jr., consumed the safety of the supply chain, trading quality for the least cost poison of melamine. And the headless legacy they left behind is now consuming the freedom of Thai slaves and the childhood of migrant workers. The checkerboard is a lie. It represents a balance, red and white, order and purity. But there is no balance. There is only a red square of blood and a white square of silence. The Danforths taught America that efficiency is the highest virtue. They taught us that cheap food is a birthright, but they never told us the price. We are only now, a century later, looking at the bill. It is paid in the kidney failure of our pets, the misery of the ghost ships, and the chemical burns on the hands of 13-year-olds. The Danforth family may have left the building, but we are all still living in the cage they built.